Good morning, everybody. My name is Emily Rees, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this latest event of the new EU-UK Forum. Outside the EU, why the best alternative model, the European Economic Area, EEA, cannot be the best alternative for the UK. As you will probably have seen from the mission statement from the forum, from the mission statement, the forum aims to facilitate and nurture a constructive and informed dialogue between the UK and its European neighbours, whatever the outcome of the current negotiations. It is a non-partisan platform, and it's designed for discussion, debate, and information exchange. With that in mind, we will very much welcome your insights, expertise, and ideas, and we look forward very much to your participation today in the chat. So a couple of words on the housekeeping for today. And how we're going to use the platform. You're watching this session in the stage area. You can use the chat area on the right-hand side to post your comments and questions throughout the session. These will be fed back through to me. You can toggle between the event chat, which is used for any discussion with organizers and participants throughout the event, and the stage chat, which is for questions and comments on this session. Please remember to post all your questions to our speakers today in the stage chat. And now, allow me to introduce our speakers of today. Martin Westlake is a visiting professor in practice at the LSE, the London School of Economics European Institute, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. He has spent over 4 decades studying European integration and working in European Union government and politics. He has worked in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg and in the Council of the European Union and the European Commission and with the European Parliament. And since 2003, Martin is in the European Economic and Social Committee, where he has served as a Secretary General between 2008 and 2013. He has published a wide variety of articles and books on the European institutions and on European and British politics. And it is a pleasure to have him with us today. Before I introduce our second speaker, perhaps Martin, just as we kick off here, June 2016, the people of the UK voted to leave the European Union, and on the 23rd of January of 2019, the UK formally left. The question then of whether the UK would actually leave, in a way, was resolved at that time. And we are now in this transition period with the clock ticking until the end of this year. And effectively, the UK has become, in the eyes of the European Union, a third country. What exactly does it mean to become a third country of the European Union? And I understand that this really is at the bottom of this book that you've brought together, all these amazing specialists in all the different operations, all the different relationships that we can have with the European Union. You've brought together in this book outside the EU, and I'd really love to hear what is the logic behind the book, and what does it mean for the UK to become a third country today?
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the EU-UK Forum, and in particular to the indefatigable Paul Adamson for hosting this event. 2 caveats, if I may. Obviously, perhaps I've never been a Brexiteer, but all Remainers have to acknowledge that British exceptionalism was reaching its limits before 2016. And in that context, this now much forgotten document, the 23rd February 2016 new settlement that David Cameron negotiated with the EU and then forgot about, was probably, as Sir Ivan Rogers put it, the last attempt to entrench British exceptionalism within the EU's legal order. And so the name of the game now is probably British exceptionism outside the EU. Now, you asked your question, what does it mean to be a third country? Well, basically, it means not being a member state. And indeed, that is the spirit that led me to edit this book outside the EU. The second caveat is that publishers don't like question marks. There used to be a question mark after options for Britain. As we know, the referendum result was a negative. For the Remain side, there was no alternative. But for the Leave side, there were all sorts of alternatives. And we got into a sort of a miasma of slogans on the one hand and models on the other. So it was take back control, Brexit means Brexit, get Brexit done, global Britain, all these slogans. And on the other hand, we had all sorts of country models bandied around, Norway, Canada plus, Switzerland, Ukraine, Australia, Turkey, Singapore on the Thames. The basic assumption behind this book, and indeed, I think behind the EU-UK Forum, is that there will be a future relationship between the UK and its largest trading partner, inevitably. So what sort of model could it be, or what sort of models could tell us what it might be? And that led to the basic idea behind this book, which was to get experts on these particular models to look at them, to explain them to the reader, and to see how relevant they might be to the case of the UK. Some of them are completely irrelevant, by the way. For example, Singapore, it's not low tax, it's not low regulation, it's not even open trade. So there's a weird misunderstanding in the case of some of these models. There are other themes and aspects of the Brexit process which are examined in the book, but we're not going to talk about them today. For example, the original 1954 association agreement between the European coal and steel community and the UK. What might that tell us about the future relationship now? Those sorts of things. But today we're talking about one particular model. So I'm going to close with a few general observations that I have drawn in editing the book. The first is what I call the myth of a monolithic European Union. The European Union is far from being monolithic. If you look at two obvious examples, the Euro and the Schengen area, not all member states are in them, and some states from outside the Union, third countries, are in them. So the European Union, when you look more closely at it, it has a sort of a variegated appearance. The second is what I call the myth of the unidirectional integration process. Territories do occasionally leave the European Union. Algeria, Greenland, now the United Kingdom. The EU does say on occasion no to countries that would like to join the European Union. Most recently in 2012, it was the case for Andorra, Monaco and San Marino. And there are countries that decide that they don't want to be in. And we're going to be looking at one of those countries today. Others I could mention are Iceland and Switzerland, for example. A third conclusion or observation that I draw is that states decide what is best for themselves according to their own democratic devices and traditions. In 1972, when the UK was negotiating its membership of the then European Economic Community, there was no tradition of referendums in the UK. In a referendum in 1972, the UK would almost certainly have followed the example of Norway and not joined the European Economic Community as it then was. Of course, then there was no tradition of referenda, so we became a member state of the European Economic Community via a parliamentary act. Nowadays, the whole concept of the referendum in the UK is constitutionalized, and so the name of the game has changed a bit. And my fourth and last conclusion or observation is that in deciding what's best, there are always trade-offs for states between competing interests. Of course, you have economic interests, but you also have political advantages and disadvantages. There are constitutional, democratic, sentimental, historical, and geographical considerations which are also taken into account and which explain a lot behind the various models that I've referred to earlier. But one thing is clear. At the end of the day, nobody can escape from this. This is a book by Anu Bradford, The Brussels Effect. the EU remains, even without the UK, a regulatory and a trading giant, and to a certain extent, nobody can escape its gravitational pull. Back to you, Emily.
So this Norway option, and thank you, Martin, for these great remarks. This Norway option was a term that has cropped up repeatedly in the debate over the UK's exit from the European Union. And perhaps that was sort of a shorthand for staying in the single market, but without EU membership. So I could think of no one better than our next speaker, Sebastian Ramoy, to talk us through the Norway option. Sebastian is Executive Vice President, Head of Public Affairs at Eea worldwide, and also leads the company's trade, competition and investment practice, as well as the Brexit team. Sebastian was EFTA's representative on EU's Internal Market Advisory Committee and secretary to EFTA's horizontal group on the Lisbon internal market strategies. Prior to this, he was a senior trade specialist and deputy head of the commercial section at the US embassies in London and Oslo. And we're very grateful to have Sebastian join us today to take us through this specificity that Norway has in relationship to the EU. First, Sebastian, so many acronyms this morning. Perhaps you could take us through what exactly is the EEA and EFTA and how are they different? And secondly, Martin just described the EU as being far from monolithic. We understand this Norway option as is it a state of perpetual negotiation with the EU? Is that the right way to qualify this relationship? Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you to Paul and Martin for inviting me to discuss one of my favorite subjects, which is the EEA Agreement, European Economic Area Agreement, which is the deepest and most comprehensive trade agreement ever negotiated between two sides. I see that in the book also Ukraine is claiming that space, and I understand that agreement is also extremely close, but it's very differently structured. I should also like to say that the EEA agreement, or what was called the Norway option in the Brexit debate and the post-Brexit debate, more correctly should be called the EEA option, because it's not just about Norway, it's also about Iceland and Liechtenstein, which Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein are all EFTA member states, but so is Switzerland, and Switzerland has a different setup. And that's described by George Bauer in the book extremely well. So what is this EEA option or Norway option? Firstly, there are two key factors that identify the EEA agreement, and these have to be remembered. This is that it is a dynamic agreement, and the other key word is homogeneity. So there is a process of dynamic alignment between the EEA EFTA states and the EU EEA states, which basically is supposed to guarantee that the rule book, in terms of the single market, is identical or homogeneous. And there is a two-pillar structure to manage this process. There's an EU pillar with the presidency of the EU, the European External Action Service, which meets with the EU Standing Committee at ambassador level about 8 times a year in something called the Joint Committee. Then there's the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which sort of polices the EEA agreement in the same way that the European Commission polices or looks after the treaties on the EU side. And then there's the EFTA Court, which corresponds with the ECJ, European Court of Justice. And then there are advisory bodies on the EFTA pillar that meet, one is called the Consultative Committee that meets with the European Economic and Social Committee, and also the Parliamentary Committee that meets with the European Parliament. Now, the whole point of this structure, and the whole reason this structure exists, is to extend the four freedoms of the single market to the EEA EFTA states, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And that means free movement of goods, services, capital, and persons. So you can see why it started to become quite interesting to people in the UK who were looking for alternative models. It pretty much basically allows Norway to participate 100% in the single market with two key exceptions, actually. Agriculture and fisheries are excluded, although all the regulations regarding veterinary standards and phytosanitary standards are harmonized, but there are not zero tariffs in those two areas. The reason it starts to become problematic for the UK is that the EFTA countries and Norway is a rule taker. Basically, in 2019, 319 joint committee decisions were made incorporating 709 legal acts into the law books of the EFTA states. That was 20,000 pages of legislation. Now, it's not the case that the EFTA countries, the EEA EFTA countries, don't have any say in this. They, through the Eea Agreement, have access to hundreds of committees and also EU agencies on a non-voting basis. So they can participate in expert committees, comitology committees, and program committees, but they don't get a vote. And in comitology committees, they will give their opinions, and then when the voting happens, they'll have to leave. And the same with agencies. They are not voting members of the agencies. So what does this mean? Would the Eea Agreement have been a way for the UK to take back control? Absolutely not. If you look at the stepladder that Michel Barnier used to look at, there are three red lines that wouldn't have worked for the UK. One was that Norway and the other EEA EFTA states are rule takers, those 709 legal acts that were incorporated into their national legislation. Secondly, the agreement relies on European Court of Justice jurisprudence, although there are occasions where maybe the EFTA court goes ahead and makes a ruling that then has to be taken into account by the ECJ. And thirdly, there's a heavy funding component. So there's cohesion funding, and Norway pays a lot of money basically to even out economic and social disparities within the single market to the countries that most need that. Yeah, but there is a question, could it have worked, or could it work as a temporary structure? It was designed as a temporary structure. In fact, Sweden, Finland, and Austria, for example, were members of the EEA before they joined the EU for a year or so. It wasn't a very long period, and it was expected also that Norway would join, but they voted no in 1994. So the other question is, will the EEA survive? It is being steadily forgotten to a certain extent. The people who designed it and wrote the Eea Agreement have retired, and you have to remember that when it came into existence, there were 15 member states. There are now 27 member states. Last year, there were 28 member states. So the capacity of the EU to manage an agreement and a structure for about 5.5 million, 6 million people is it's not the same as it was. And therefore, it's a concern on the EFTA side that how do you remind people about the Eea Agreement? One of the thoughts, and some people on the EFTA side thought, well, maybe if the UK joins the EEA as an EFTA state, it will reinvigorate the Eea Agreement. But there were also a lot of people who were very worried that if the UK stepped into the EEA EFTA boat, it would have capsized that boat because it was so much bigger. I think I'll leave it there, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. I know one question is, how can Norway and the other EFTA states, how do they influence policy and legislation on the EU side? It could be interesting from a UK perspective.
It will certainly be very interesting to learn now how Norway does use its role to influence the rules and regulations that come out of Brussels. You mentioned very clearly that this rule-taking role that Norway has accepted as part of its relationship to the EU really is one of the principal reasons why it was deemed as an inappropriate operational structure for the UK in its new relationship to the EU, as so much of the Brexit debate surrounded, a newly found sovereignty in areas such as trade. You also very clearly mentioned, the risk of the EEA being forgotten in all of this. And that there was this hypothetical moment in the debate when we were wondering whether the UK could join the EEA. Sebastian, what was the feeling from the EEA states when this sort of option of the UK joining the EEA came to the fore? Was there concern that that would create so much asymmetry, imbalance, maybe put a bit of a spotlight on them in a way that wouldn't be welcome? What was the feeling in those capitals?
Well, I'm best qualified to talk about the country I know best, which is Norway. And there was concern in government circles that the UK really understand the compromises that are involved in EEA membership, but also that there was a fear that the UK would put its foot down on a lot of issues that the other countries wanted to incorporate into the EEA agreement. So, some of those 20,000 pages that were of legal acts that were incorporated, there's a principle in the EEA agreement called the Unanimity Principle, which means that if one country wants, on the EEA side, does not accept to incorporate legislation into the EEA agreement, it does not just block it for that country, but it blocks it for the other countries as well. It blocks it for everybody. So it just won't go into the EEA agreement. And looking at the UK and its sense of exceptionalism and its penchant for opt-outs, I know a lot of Norwegian officials and diplomats and politicians who were saying, well, what's going to happen to the EEA agreement if we have this huge behemoth coming into the EEA agreement and then wanting to opt out or refusing to accept legislation that the other countries wanted to put into it. So there was a fear that the UK could in a sense be a wrecking ball for the EEA agreement. But on the other side, there were those who said the EEA agreement is getting relatively smaller and smaller. It's not a two-pillar structure, it's more like a straw and a pillar. And we need to beef up the size of the EFTA pillar. So there were those advocates who were quite keen, some of them in Iceland and other countries, and probably some in Norway as well. But overwhelmingly in Norway, there was a sort of a skepticism to the idea.
In this sort of blocking aspect, so the fact that the EEA requires unanimity for a lot of its sort of decisions, I mean, in a way, that's also what we see in a number of areas of trade policy in the European Union, that de facto council decisions are taken by unanimity in this area. And I would like to ask Martin, you showed us the book of this sort of Brussels effect. Could we not speak of a London effect after the UK leaves the EU that would be gained through its flexibility, the flexibility that it doesn't have today, through the fact that many of these trade decisions have to be taken through unanimity?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think indeed one can. It's a very good question. I think one indeed can talk about a London effect or a UK effect in some specific areas in particular. If one looks at the city and the venture capital market, for example, for the time being, a lot of the European Union's venture capital is to be found in London. Now, it would be rash to assume that all of that is going to go to Paris or Frankfurt or Berlin or Luxembourg or somewhere else after the end of this year. Indeed, one of my former colleagues, Sir Jonathan Fall, brought out a very interesting pamphlet in which he urged the EU, and he is a former high-ranking EU official, as most people will probably know, he urged the EU to think very carefully about what it did in the capital markets area, because by trying to exclude UK venture capital, the EU risked also excluding other capital from around the world. So there is an example, in a sense, of the London effect. And the UK effect, obviously, in areas like security and intelligence, it's difficult to imagine, and in foreign policy more generally, it's difficult to imagine once the dust has settled, and of course the dust and the rhetoric has to settle, but it's difficult to imagine that there won't be a very close relationship between the UK and the European Union, and with certain member states within the European Union, such as France and Germany. And obviously there is also the NATO framework. So the other thing I would say is I wouldn't get hung up about the unanimity principle, but I think David Cameron justifiably got hung up about the qualified majority principle. It's all water under the bridge now and forgotten, but his great concern from the Bloomberg speech on was not about migration and all of the issues that actually figured in the referendum campaign in the UK. It was about the fact that the a qualified majority within the Euro area could outvote the UK in the internal market area, if one makes a distinction between the two. And so he and George Osborne and Ivan Rogers spent a lot of time working out how it might be possible for the UK to remain fully within the internal market without its interests being affected by a qualified majority, as I say, of Eurozone member states. So a good question. And I suspect, I know Sebastian and I have had many discussions about this. I suspect in the longer term, again, as I say, when the dust has settled, in the longer term, reason will prevail and a more malleable and flexible form of relationship between the UK and the EU will emerge. But it's going to take time and a lot of effort on both sides, I think.
Thank you so much for those great insights. We're talking about the importance of being part of these internal market decisions, right? I mean, those are really the ones that impact the economy. And what we're seeing from the Norway example is that doesn't necessarily require being a member of the European Union. So we have a question here from our audience asking us, well, what were the principal benefits to Norway of not joining the European Union? And I would add to that, Sebastian, you mentioned that one of the key elements that was excluded from Norway's operational relationship with the EU was the fact that the agriculture and fisheries, despite the fact that they respect all the food safety rules of the European Union, are excluded from the relationship. And so I was wondering if you could explain what were the benefits for Norway in that case. We know that these are going to be very challenging discussions that are ongoing right now between the EU and the UK on fisheries in particular. And I'm sure that Norway, as a great fishing state, might have some words of wisdom for us here.
Thank you. It's a good and very complicated question. It wasn't just about fisheries and agriculture, but that did influence a lot of people, particularly in rural and coastal parts of Norway, who were worried that EU fishermen or fishing people were going to come into Norwegian waters and hoover up all their cod. Norway has a system, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on the fisheries side, but of zonal attachment, which was something that the UK has been arguing for in its negotiations with the EU. But I think those, if you talk to the people who were negotiating for Norwegian entry into the EU in the early 90s, they might say that they had found good solutions to that. So, and they lamented the fact that Norway didn't join in '94 and also in the early '70s. There have been two referendums, and both of them were very close. So, about 52%, 53% voting against EU membership. But there are also other reasons. I mean, Norway was on the periphery of Europe geographically, and it felt that a small state could never really influence affairs in Brussels. I think this is wrong. And in the chapter that I wrote, I point to Ireland, which also has 5 million people, but it has had the presidency and has had a president of the European Parliament not so long ago, and Secretary General of the Commission. Ireland exerts a lot of influence for a country that is about the same size as Norway. It's very, very possible. It's also had very powerful commissioners. But yeah, it's Norway. There's a debate in Norway about whether there is more sovereignty. It retains more of its sovereignty in the EEA or in the EU. And some people who are really Eurosceptical also advocating for a Swiss-style agreement with bilateral agreements. But on the whole, I think there's pretty good support in the Norwegian population, about 70% for EEA membership, but there's very little support for EU membership.
On that point, you said, so there were two referendums in Norway, and that the agriculture and fisheries was part of the discussion as to what had influenced that decision. May I ask you how informed the debate was at the time in Norway?
Well, it's dangerous to comment on that. I think it was informed, but also it was very, very heated, and it was divisive, and it had a lasting impact in Norwegian politics and society. In the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a suicide clause in coalition governments to say that anyone who raises the issue of EU membership will bring about the dissolution of the coalition. So it's still a very heated subject. I think, actually, ironically, the whole Brexit episode has forced Norwegians again to look at the Eea Agreement and think about EU membership. But right now, it seems that there's still fundamentally support for the Eea Agreement, but there's not a lot of enthusiasm for EU membership at the moment.
So, I mean, we're hearing that basically this discussion, this debate that took place in Norway has had a long divisive impact. And turning to you, Martin, I mean, the outcome of all these years of discussion now, right, of negotiations, of ins and outs in this relationship with Brussels from a UK perspective. What do you think the impact will be of the divisiveness that has come out of this debate in the UK in structuring the relationship with the EU?
It's another very good question. Harking back to what Sebastian has just said about Norway. Of course, in the first Norwegian referendum in 1972, the political and economic elites were massively in favour of membership of the European Union, of the European Economic Communities, sorry. And the result, I think, was about 52 or 53%. It came as something of a shock because, hey, there was public opinion out there. Now, of course, you're referring to public opinion in the United Kingdom, which was very much divided. These referenda experiences, whether it's Scottish independence or membership of the European Union, they are divisive and very unpleasant in terms of the emotions and the sentiments that are generated. Families divided, friendships broken up, people not daring to raise the issue at dinner tables. We even had, of course, it was a madman, but we had an assassination of an MP in the UK. yes, a lot of poison out there, a lot of venom, a lot of resentment on both sides, which I think, I mean, obviously, we're not going to go into a great debate about the effect of the social media and social media platforms, but I think, in a sense, they are self-confirming communities. If you go on, for example, Facebook, you will find people who share your opinion about how loathsome Brexiteers are, with all sorts of awful vocabulary about them. And the same works the other way around. So in a sense, the social media are reinforcing the passions and the negativity that is there. The media doesn't help still, especially not the so-called tabloid press. And in addition, I would say a problem the UK has, a fundamental, a profound problem, is that it has no mechanism to generate national consensus. All of its political system is predicated on government and opposition, on everything. And that means that it's extremely difficult, unless you get something coming along like a war. It's extremely on and on. People already talk about Brexit fatigue. They turn off, which means that they don't inform themselves anymore about the options that are still out there, the legitimate options, and the legitimate choices that still have to be made about the country's economic and political future. My hope is that, as I say, the dust will settle fairly quickly and will be replaced by traditional Anglo-Saxon pragmatism. But I think you're absolutely right to raise this issue of public opinion. And I think Sebastian would confirm the same issue in Norway, that, public opinion and the strength of it is not going to go away fast.
So what I'm hearing here, Martin, is that we are all to avoid talking Brexit over our Christmas turkeys this year, as the clock ticks and British families will be sort of putting a veto on any political discussion over Christmas. We have a great question here from Helen Campbell, who's the director of the National Network for Interpreting in the UK. And she's asking about this Australian-style trade deal. She's saying that the UK government has mentioned an Australian-style trade deal on various occasions, and she's not aware that any comprehensive deal exists. Is this just another red herring, she asks? Who would like to take that question? Martin?
Well, I'll start if I may. Australia is shorthand for World Trade Organization terms. And there is a chapter in the book written by Professor Alan Winters, which shows what a terrible a massive economic shock it would be for the UK system. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be avoided, but that shock will be there. Interestingly, I'll pass on to Sebastian in a moment, but there is another chapter in the book written by Australia's longest serving foreign minister, Alexander Downer, which talks about 1973 and the experience of Australia and New Zealand in what was then called the Great Betrayal, which was all of a sudden the Australian and New Zealand economies found their privileged access to the UK markets completely erased because the UK had joined the economic community. And as a condition of joining, it had to shut out its former Commonwealth partners, and in particular Australia and New Zealand, which their economies, their agrarian economies, were largely based on exporting beef, lamb, cheese to the UK market. Now, what Alexander Downer shows in his chapter is that, in a sense, it did Australia a favour because it imposed a more reasonable and rational economic logic on the country. Normally, countries trade most with countries that are closer to them. And of course, the UK was not at all close to Australia and New Zealand. So Australia and New Zealand had to start looking for markets elsewhere, in particular around them in Asia. And they did it very successfully. They also had to admit to themselves that they had been running a sort of a subsidized form of economy based on massive subsidies to the agricultural sector. All of those farms, cattle farms, sheep farms, a lot of them disappeared, and they were replaced by a much leaner system, including entrepreneurial developments such as the creation of vineyards and all of the Australian wines that are drunk around the world today, Australian and New Zealand wines. So Alexander Downer shows that you can do it, and Australia and New Zealand did do it, but they did it by going to their neighbouring markets. And it was the cause of a great deal of pain over a long period of time. So there are two lessons in there, I think, for the UK to look very seriously at, because the EU is next door. The EU is not around the other side of the globe. And there was a lot of pain involved. And the pain is described in statistical detail by Alan Winter's chapter in the book.
Thank you for that incredible remark. I mean, I think that this transition and the impact that can have is one that perhaps the UK isn't discussing, as we mentioned. Sebastian, over to you. What do you think about this Australian style relationship that's being put forward in London? Is it a red herring?
Well, I think it is. Australia was picked as a name because of the historical ties, but somebody pointed out it could be the Ugandan model or the Cambodian model, although they might benefit from some preferential treatment, but it doesn't really help you very much. One essential fact to support Martin's point, and this goes also to the issue of the Brussels effect. Well, firstly, let's deal with the fact that the UK sells more to Belgium than it does to China and India together, China, India, and Australia together. So you absolutely trade, and you ask any business person who you trade most with, you trade most with your closest neighbours. 46% of UK exports go to the EU. And 55% of imports come from the EU. The other point I'd quickly like to mention is that, I mean, this is also why the Eea Agreement exists. There were free trade agreements which dealt with tariffs between the EFTA countries and the EU since the early 1970s. But Norway and the other EFTA countries found out that that wasn't enough, particularly when the EU was talking about establishing the single market. With the Cicchini report. And so what they realized was that they needed an agreement that dealt with all the other issues outside of tariffs, because tariffs were already low or non-existent across many areas. So it was really the Eea Agreement is an effort to deal with the non-tariff barriers to trade, technical barriers to trade, to make sure that product standards are harmonized between the EEA EFTA states and, well, the EFTA states and the EU, because Switzerland also harmonizes a lot of regulations, and it was to simplify processes. So I don't see how Australia or any other model that is basically the WTO model will help the UK to deal with the red tape and bureaucracy that exists for countries that are dealing within that model.
So in sum, I hear that gravity matters and that a Canada-style agreement would be insufficient. Martin?
Yeah, no, sorry, Emily, I wanted to jump back on something Sebastian said in passing. He quite rightly said that Australia was chosen because it raises all sorts of nice sentiments in British public opinion, rather than the reality of the WTO relationship. But there is a risk here. There is something going on, a sort of insidious use of vocabulary to play to prejudices. And I do worry quite a lot about that, because obviously now Australia is emotive, it sounds nice. But one hears quite a lot already in the debate about how the EU is denying the UK the latitude that it requires to create the relationship that it wishes to have with the EU and indeed with the rest of the world. And so you hear this phrase EU intransigence. I mean, for those who are closer to the coalface, we all know that the EU has gone out of its way. I mean, it's fallen over backwards to accept delayed Brexit dates again and again and again to allow the UK Parliament the time to try and come to some sort of consensus. But the way it's being played in the UK in terms of public opinion is, as I said, insidious. And I think it's very risky because all of that is negative. There may be positives out there. There may be a positive vision for the UK to develop. And it would be far better, I think, for the political process in the UK to be thinking about how to generate that, how to generate the vision and how to realize it.
Thanks for that. May I move our conversation now to economic diplomacy and the future of British economic diplomacy to the EU? As we know, third country member states spend a huge amount of energy trying to influence the rules and regulations of the European Union from outside of the room. And so now that the United Kingdom will no longer have a permanent representation, but will have a mission to the European Union, it will perhaps now gain a unit within DG Trade with whom it will have to pass all its official discussions. I mean, we see how third countries act in Brussels in particular. They have to build coalitions, they have to work together in order to have some voice in the discussion. How do both of you see the UK now trying to join these coalitions, build its status without actually having the keys to the room? Sebastian?
I can have a crack at that. Firstly, from the I mentioned the several hundred committees and the agencies that Norway has access to and the other EEA states have access to, and those are really important. And also the structure, the two-pillar structure. There are a lot of subcommittees and working groups under the standing committee where the EFTA states, the EEA states, get a lot of information about upcoming regulation, and are able to, through all of these different structures, influence the way that the EU legislates on important issues. And for example, where Norway is a heavyweight in terms of oil and gas and energy or in fisheries, the EU does listen to Norwegian officials and experts because the EU likes expertise. Now, this is actually good news. What's not good news for the UK is that through the sort of agreement that's being envisaged and negotiated at the moment, the UK will not have the same sort of access to these committees. But I still think there is some good news, which is the EU likes to collect examples and knowledge of best practice, and it likes to accumulate expertise when it's making its legislation. And this is an opportunity for the UK to be able to provide input, but on the same basis that people from other third countries do, and other third country governments and economic operators do. You have to be very proactive, you have to be vigilant, you have to look at what's coming down the pipeline, and then you have to come in early with the input at the right time and the right place. For example, don't go to the European Parliament before they have got a proposal from the European Commission for a piece of legislation. And one thing is that the UK actually understands this process very well because it's been a member for 40 years, but it's going to have to influence and decision shape from a very different starting point.
So we have a question here, if I may, from Rita Giannini Watson, who's a policy advisor to the UK Law Societies in the Brussels office. And she's asking us about once the UK leaves all these types of legal cooperation, such as judicial cooperation in civil and commercial matters, criminal law and security, how will it be possible to construct new legal ways of collaboration? So again, we're coming back to this question of how do you build collaboration? How do you input into the process as a third country? And in this case, in the question of legal matters. Martin, would you like to take Rita's question?
Ciao, Rita. Well, there's no easy answer to that question, but I'd like to dovetail my reply onto what Sebastian was saying. I think, ironically, the exit of the UK from the front room, as it were, is going to strengthen British diplomacy and strengthen the role of British diplomacy, certainly in British diplomats, who have justifiably, I think, a very high reputation. So I think from one certain point of view, the fact that the FCO is now going to be more involved in both bilateral and multilateral diplomacy in trying to assure the UK's interests is good news, in inverted commas, because the UK diplomatic service happens to be good and will now find its role reinforced. Related to that, though, I think Michel Barnier has frankly played a blinder, because throughout the whole of this Brexit negotiation process, there hasn't been a whiff of any sort of division in the ranks of the member states. He has managed to maintain solidarity. He's done it through his briefings and so on. But I think in that context, one shouldn't underestimate the power of the Northern Ireland card, if I can put it like that, the Good Friday Agreement, and the way in which the EU has very cleverly, with traditional typical cleverness, used fears of the Good Friday Agreement foundering to ensure solidarity among the member states, because there, but for the grace of God, go I, is the basic logic of the European Union. However, once that trump card has gone, as one must imagine it will at one stage, there will be the future relationship, and Ireland will function in the way, the island of Ireland and the UK will function in a way that is not yet entirely clear to me, I have to say. But assuming that is done, then I suspect that there could be a risk that the UK will start to practice bilateral diplomacy more. And I'd be interested to hear what Sebastian thinks about that, because once that reason for solidarity has gone, then that's a risk, a potential risk I see. Coming back to Rita's question, though, of course, the Bar Society, people are scratching their heads, desperately wondering how they are going to ensure some sort of cooperation. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that through a system of nods and winks, we will come back to something not exactly the same as before, but something similar. The example I have in mind is when during the mad cow crisis, as it was called, the BSE crisis, a desperate John Major at one stage declared that there would be a non-cooperation policy with the EU. Now, those slightly longer in tooth like me remember what the non-cooperation policy meant in practice. It meant that although theoretically the UK wasn't in the room, a lot of the time it was. And when it was saying it couldn't possibly cooperate, but the people who were saying it couldn't possibly cooperate were nodding and winking. So I think, a system of nods and winks and friendships and informal networking, bilateral diplomacy with particular member states to ensure that the interests are put across, I think that's the name of the game for the future.
Sebastian, as we wrap up here, perhaps coming back to that earlier point that Martin just made about these very smart and savvy British diplomats coming with their divide and conquer strategies with the member states. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think there's one thing that the EU is going to continue to be very vigilant about, and that is not to allow cherry picking. And it's been very consistent. It's been consistent messaging from Michel Barnier's team and from all of the member states, not least from Germany, because it doesn't want to see the unraveling of the single market because cherry picking is allowed, which could then encourage other countries to say, well, I like this bit of the single market and EU membership and not that bit. So no matter how clever and wily you are, you're going to have to live with that reality. And I think Norwegian diplomats and Icelandic and Liechtenstein diplomats, who are also very clever and wily, understood this a long time ago, which is why the Eea Agreement exists. You cannot be a partial member of the single market. So you have to choose. I should also like to say that Norway, is not just managing its relationship with the EU through the Eea Agreement, but it has 70, 80 plus other agreements with the EU through which it manages its relationship, such as Schengen, Dublin, Prüm. There's a whole list of them. And in fact, there was a fantastic white paper that was delivered to the Norwegian Parliament, I think it was in 2012, called Inside and Outside, and it looked at the whole relationship of Norway between the EU, looking at all of these different treaties and agreements, and it found out that Norway was sort of 75% in the EU without being in the EU. But in terms of the single market, it's really completely in the single market, not bearing in mind the exceptions for fisheries and agriculture. But I go back to the first point that I made, that beware of any sort of notion that you can claim partial, you can negotiate your way into partial membership of the single market.
So on those great words of wisdom that I'm sure will have echoed today, both in London and Brussels, I would like to thank both of you for participating in this discussion, and to our audience for all the great questions that came in today. With that, we look forward to hosting more EU-UK Forum events very soon. Stay tuned to the social media account EU-UK Forum. And with that, I wish you a very good day. Thank you.